Hello and welcome to my review of Friday by Robert A. Heinlein. I'm not ashamed to tell you that this review will be triggering to some, especially to fans of the book, if such people exist anywhere, but more likely everyone else as well. When Heinlein wrote Farnham's Freehold in 1964, the New Republic called it an anti-racist novel only a Klansman could love. Quite fitting then that Friday, published in 1982, is an anti-sexism novel that will anger feminists and misogynists in equal amount. And if you're wondering, that amount is a lot. Heinlein made his name writing Boys' Own Bildungsroman in the 1950s. Most of this was specifically targeted towards a Christmas young adult market. Starship Troopers marked the end of that phase and the beginning of Heinlein pushing his political agendas more and more, until his sci-fi yarns became little more than a veneer for his politics. This is the sort of tactic that's turned Star Wars from a beloved family-friendly saga into a divisive and toxic movie franchise, so Heinlein fans can rejoice knowing he was ahead of his time again. The plot of Friday is extraordinarily difficult to summarise succinctly because it is just a meandering mess. Hints at an actual story come and go, born on the arms of Friday's many lovers, but none of them adhere quite so well as one assumes her bedsheets. Friday is a courier travelling the galaxy delivering messages secreted in her body. She works for an unspecified organisation and is told only what she needs to know. Given the format of the novel, the book being written in a first-person style, supposedly Friday's journal, this leaves the audience in the dark as well. After returning from a mission during which she fails to notice she was being followed the whole time, and failed to notice the suspicious explosion of an entire hotel, she fails to notice the suspicious fact someone is waiting to pick her up at the port, despite the fact her arrival was supposedly known only to her. The net result of this opening is that it unfortunately portrays Friday as both cold and incompetent, rather than as an engaging heroine. She is then abducted and gang-raped and tortured, some of which is explicit, but remember, this book was published in 1982, not 2018, so it isn't as explicit as perhaps it might be if somebody was stupid enough to write this book again today. Friday bears it all rather stoically, which may well anger some more than the actual events. She is rescued and recuperates over many pages and repays all of her rescuers by sleeping with them. She then takes some leave and visits her family in New Zealand. Readers of Heinlein will be familiar with the family model pushed here. The multiple wives and husband unit has been espoused in many of his books. It's a tired and boring concept explained in great detail here, as it was in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and others. This repetition is unnecessary, as by this late in his career surely only die-hard fans were clinging to the last feeble hopes of a return to form. Heinlein then launches into a lengthy anti-racism section of the book. One of the New Zealand family has married a Tongan, causing much grinding of teeth in the family. Friday, as part Cherokee and full artificial person, has battled racism all her life, and in keeping with the much more modern me attitude, turns this into some self-pitying and virtue signalling, and informs the family of her own status. Perhaps in a different video we could look at why they make artificial people of ethnic groups in a world so riddled with prejudice, but we will skip to their chase. Her family kick her out. They're bad people. This book has no issue with Friday entering into the marriage contract under false pretenses. The contract is described down to its various clauses. Even if you're not triggered by my raising that question on a moral standpoint, given that the contract explicitly excludes artificial people, she is guilty of fraud if nothing else. After hopping out of the New Zealand shared bed, she hops into one down the road shared by a day-old acquaintance and his roommate and her husband. From there, she hops back to Canada and into bed with one of her current partner's other families of three. This sex with multiple partners trope that brought Heinlein some credibility with the hippie community in the early 60s might have been fresh then. In 1982 it was old hat to anyone familiar with his work, and in 2018 it's just boring. This flurry of boring, passionless, loveless sex goes on far too long and feels laborious. Then the book actually threatens to happen. A series of high-ranking people are murdered, related via the news channels repeating of various groups' claims to be responsible. Many of the borders are closed, and Friday is stuck on the wrong side. Instead of a daring crossing of a militarized border, however, what we get is a holiday in a bonkers separated Californian republic. The book then threatens to happen again. Friday joins a military company heading upriver for unspecified reasons. The ships are destroyed before anything happens. Sadly, Friday is the only survivor. She then travels into the Imperium, cannot contact anyone in her company, returns to Canada and cannot find any of her lovers, returns to California, and finally makes contact with her boss, where she discovers the murders were something of nothing, the military action was something of nothing, and that her boss is Kettlebelly Baldwin, a returning character from Heinlein's earlier story, Golf, which probably nobody remembered anyway, given that this was published some 33 years later. She then uses the internet. Her boss dies, the company is dissolved, she bums around for a bit, discovers the joy of being a housewife, and then travels into space, unwittingly impregnated by a shady colonist organisation. Discovering the trick, she decides she will likely be murdered after the baby is delivered, and ducks out at a remote human colony, taking 2 of her guards, both hopelessly in love with her of course, and conveniently running into one family of lovers she presumed missing/dead. Heinlein, writing in his senior years, had not lost all of the enthusiasm and vigour of his early work. Despite the weaknesses in both plot and character, Friday is one of those books you can read for a couple of hours without realising you've been at it so long. To call it a page-turner would be far too high praise, but it occasionally feels worth grinding through. More often than not, though, that grind is performed with a forlorn hope that something good will happen soon. They're actually the beginnings of a decent book here. If you cut everything from her returning from her first mission to her beginning her last, you might have the beginnings of something. However, it would only be 50 pages, not 432 as presented here, and 30 of those, in this form, are wasted anyway on pointless detail such as the star maps on page 363, 364, 366, and 367. Perhaps in his early years, Heinlein's public proclamations of libertarianism came across as sincere. Here they feel like grandstanding on dubious issues such as group sex, and virtue signalling on subjects that are, if anything, even more hot-button today than they were in 1982, such as feminism and racism. His heavy-handed approach to both, coupled with the ugly events of the novel, mean that his efforts to promote equality will likely irritate or anger even those actively campaigning in those industries. The absolute worst example being in the final passages of the book where Friday marries one of her rapists. Friday should have been the sort of dynamic character we saw just 2 years later in the wonderful Ballad of Halo Jones. Instead, she is a promiscuous, stupider Anastasius Steele. As mentioned earlier, she is quite bad at her job. This is a recurrent theme, despite the many in-text insistences that she's actually quite good at it. We see this in her being suckered in the first section, leading to her abduction. She later bemoans being caught without money, even telling readers that it goes against everything she was taught in basic training. She hides from the police searching a house for her, telling readers that there was no trace of her ever having been there, despite having been painted nude earlier by one of the residents. Perhaps he painted her in the Cubist style and therefore she would be unrecognisable. Her promiscuity and jumping from family unit to family unit supposedly represents a desire to belong. Her repeated insistence that she doesn't share or understand human attitude to sex fails utterly to convince, given that the humans around her, whether part of the numerous multiple-member families or her kissing friends in the company, all immediately want to sleep with her. So it seems that their attitude to sex, despite her protestations otherwise, are more or less identical. This is further tediarized by, like Anastasius Steele, her constantly describing herself as unattractive. When the spate of assassinations take place, Friday and much of her family sit down to discuss what may or may not be happening. Like much of Stranger in a Strange Land, this just ends up feeling like being stuck at a dinner party listening to pseudo-intellectuals pontificating on something that, in truth, they know nothing about. This section of the book caused me to experience something I had never felt before. The uninformed and uninteresting dialogue is broken up by equally dull talk about how good the soup is. Never before have I wanted to yell, "Stop going on about the bloody soup," at a book. Heinlein will repeat this boring infomercial way of educating his readers. Computers are pretty good, he tells us. Pretty good. If you're fascinated by astronavigation, I call it that for ease of understanding, when Heinlein explicitly states it's not astronavigation but cosmonautics. Well, if you're a fan of that, complete with maps like this one, then you're in for a great time. Human readers can skip read those sections and not miss anything worth printing. Numerous sections are devoted to justifying Friday's actions, even when they make little sense. This is particularly noticeable in the lengthy debrief Friday undertakes with her boss after re-establishing contact. They go through all her actions in some detail, even though it's little more than recounting the book to that point. At one point, her boss justifies her killing of a policeman, saying, "I would be much disappointed in you if you ever simply injure a policeman. A wounded policeman is more dangerous than a wounded lion." On page 334, Heinlein lists something like 50 jobs that are available on a space liner, at the end adding, "and that's just a sample." So why feel the need to list all of the jobs? This is a long paragraph that can be summed up as, there are 100 different jobs available on a cruise liner. If you're trying to make a point here, make the point using your words like a grown-up. Here's my thought-up-on-the-spot alternative. There are jobs for academics, there are jobs for technicians, for the skilled, the unskilled, and for those with something to hide. It hints at the black market and colonist jumpers, and gives a flavour of the many opportunities available. If you don't like mine, you can simply embrace the trios of Sarah J. Maas with jobs, jobs, jobs. Why not? The strange, possibly bafflingly incoherent nature of the book is best explained by one event. Just a few hours before his death, Friday's boss makes her memorize an address. The address is then seen to have some kind of significance. Friday never investigates it. Her friends/lovers are missing, only the boss knew where they were, but she never puts two and two together and goes to the address. And just as well, because later she receives a messenger telling her to go to that very location for a job offer. When she does, she is given the mission that ends up with her going into space smuggling somebody else's baby, a mission that will likely end with her being murdered. So why would her boss, who cared about her a great deal, give her that address? It's basically an agency for couriers, but a highly disreputable one. He didn't say, if you're ever desperate for work, try these scumbags. He presented it like it was part of a great secret, making her memorize it and destroy the evidence. But it's basically a publicly operating employment agency. Throw in this level of stupidity, a top-secret courier who informs total strangers of her secret identity, and sleeps with literally everyone she just meets, and you almost have Friday. But to make things complete, you need to throw in some clunky racism, some clunkier feminism, a sci-fi novel where people have hover cars and commercial intercontinental rocketry, but travel via a horse and cart anyway. Throw in some unfortunate allusions to bulimia, a magician pulling pigeons from his assistant's vagina, a dash of paedophilia, and a brutal rape that ultimately sees the participants married and living happily ever after. And then, and only then, do you have Friday, a science fiction book I recommend only to people with strong masochistic urges.